Me is Georgina Downer, former diplomat and member of the Victorian Liberal Party Executive, and Bruce Hawker, former Labor campaign guru. Bruce, the country's running out of money, Western Australia putting pressure, it wants more. Does it have a case?
Well, I think it does have a case. When you see those numbers, it's quite clear that they need an injection of funds, certainly as a result of the downturn in the exports of mineral. But really, it's up to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer to make that call. They actually have to go out and say, we're going to reallocate it. I don't think it's right for the Prime Minister to do a Pontius Pilate, wash his hands of it and say it's up to the states.
He can't afford to fight, Bruce. He's in a weaker position.
Well, that's the problem. Sometimes you actually do have to have a fight, and it can be unedifying, but at the end of the day, you might get some points for doing it.
Well, it seems that they're considering maybe a special handout rather than a formal division, just here, have some money. But, Georgina, the whole point is, I'm just wondering, with that GST distribution, Northern Territory getting 5 times more, Tasmania, some of these places are getting insulated from the consequences of their poor performance. Tasmania, for example, that it's not made to feel the pain of having closed down forestry, etc. Is this right?
Well, and I mean, I think that WA itself has to take some responsibility here. I mean, they haven't perhaps engaged in the necessary economic reforms that they should have. They're a bit behind the 8 ball on privatisation, and look, they have some crazy regulations there. I mean, for example, you go to a hardware shop at 10 a.m. in the morning, you can buy a light bulb, but you can't buy light fittings until 11 a.m. I mean,
that's bizarre.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting that they are under now some pressure to do what New South Wales done, privatise poles and wires. So help themselves. And yet, this whole thing where there's now a big brawl about tax, and the states, South Australia's furious at having the prospect of having these subsidies for its disastrous policies withdrawn. It goes down to this, Bruce, how did a discussion about tax reform turn into and essentially launched by the government to lower taxes, turn into a brawl about how we should get more taxes out of this and that, how we should divide the tax take?
Well, because the government said all along that it actually has to increase the tax take if we're going to be able to maintain the standard of living that we have become accustomed to.
I don't recall it saying it needed to increase the tax take.
Well, I think it's saying that, or you start to cut services around the country. And as you said before, there doesn't seem to be a great predisposition on the part of the government to be doing that now, having spent a lot of time in the first year of its life in office actually saying it did need to cut. So now we're talking and looking at the whole question about who's paying tax, what percentage of tax are people paying, are they paying their fair share? And
as soon as you say, are they paying their fair share, the whole presupposition is they should be paying more. It's not that, are they paying too much? It's about more. Georgina, this is scaring me. Has Joe Hockey lost control of the debate that, for example, this week, a debate that started about lowering the tax burden has turned into an exercise about bashing the bosses with Sam Dastyari and Labor?
Look, Joe Hockey hasn't lost control of this debate. It's a very complicated debate. He's started this debate. He's released his discussion paper. Tax reform is always going to be difficult. He's put everything on the table. I mean, the Labor Party's Henry Review took GST out of the equation. I mean, this is a huge part of our tax system that they didn't even want to look at. The coalition is actually brave in putting everything on the table.
No, they put everything on the table, but Bruce, look, what's on the table now, it's not talking about cuts and cuts, it's talking about, hey, let's maybe have a bank deposit tax. Let's maybe have more taxes on super. Let's have a tax on foreign companies shifting revenue overseas. More GST taxes for services bought over the internet. And maybe even a bigger GST. I mean, hello.
But that's all apt for discussion.
You'd think Labor was in power.
That's all out for discussion now, and I'm the last person to be in defence of Joe Hockey. What you're seeing now is an interesting debate happening because, on the one hand, there's a suggestion that you increase the GST to 15%, which is a 50% increase in the GST, which is paid by your viewers, all those people out there paying an extra $25 billion to $30 billion a year, or you look at other ways of raising some of this tax money, and you look at this whole question about overseas multinational companies doing what multinational companies do, spreading their wealth around, but asking, well, should they actually be leaving more of that in the country where the wealth was created? I don't think that's a bad debate to be having, and I think you'll find if you asked your viewers what they'd rather see happen, they would say, well, let's actually see multinationals pay their fair share rather than us having to pay an extra 50% on
in the
GST.
abstract, there's always going to be bastard bosses, multinationals. It's so easy. Labor's going the easy route, bashing the bosses, blaming multinationals. It's so... You can see the ABC running with it.
Indeed.
But listen...
Can I just make one point about that?
We're talking pennies when we're losing pounds.
Well, we're talking about billions of dollars.
No, we're not.
And at the G20... One of the things that Joe Hockey and all the other international treasurers and prime ministers and presidents came out and talked about was the need to make sure that internationally they're cutting down on this tax avoidance and tax evasion schemes by multinational companies. It has to be dealt with on an international basis by countries.
$104 billion is going to be added to our deficits, national debt, in the next 4 years, and we're talking about maybe getting 100 million there, 100 million there from... it's
we're
ridiculous.
Talking about billions, Andrew.
Now,
the GST would raise 25
it'll be a
to
moaning
30.
tax.
If you increase the GST by 50%, it's an extra $30 billion on what they're getting at the moment.
It won't be that. Georgina, getting Apple, Google and Microsoft bosses in the one room for a brief period of time and yelling at them, that is not serious. That's a stunt.
It's absolutely a stunt, Andrew. Look, will the ATO be able to raise $1 single out of this exercise? No. The only thing it's raised is Sam Dastyari's profile.
That's exactly right. And talk about Sam Dastyari. I think this is helping Labor, obviously, because you can see it in one sense, because the government's, we'll do something about multinationals too, knowing that it's not going to raise much.
The government was already doing something about this. I mean, the ATO's been onto this for ages, and I mean...
And found what?
No, they're auditing these companies. And, look, and we've got negotiations going on at the G20 and OECD. This is an international problem, though. This isn't just... Australia can't fix this by itself. It's got to fix this in partnership with other countries. And, look, fundamentally, we've got to remain competitive.
But that's exactly right.
If we start increasing taxes here, there and everywhere, companies will leave us, especially a country like Australia that is a bit smaller.
But that's why you have to do it on an international basis.
No, but to take out Georgina's point, though, Bruce, how come the debate isn't, hey, listen, how can we possibly be competitive when Singapore's got a corporate rate of 17%, we've got 30%? Our ridiculous answer is to try and lock up that revenue here instead of realising we've made ourselves uncompetitive.
Well, Microsoft and all these companies are still going to be operating in Australia. I can give you that guarantee. That, stop the front page. That's what they're going to be doing tomorrow if you increase the taxes. They would still be here and they'd still be paying their taxes. The argument is, how much are they going to continue to move offshore? How do you stop that? By international agreement. That's what the G20 was all about. That's what Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott were talking about.
But
so
this
don't say it's just a Labor stunt.
No, I already said that they're following, that they know that they're following this because of the fear campaign. But this is cargo cult stuff. Cargo cult stuff. The real game, we're spending too much. But listen, coming up, more with a panel, and I'll ask them why the left mocks Tony Abbott for supporting his transgender friend. One of Tony Abbott's friends is a senior Air Force officer, Kate McGregor, who this week told the National Press Club about the support Abbott gave her when she changed her gender.
Suffice it to say that it meant a great deal to me when I was at a very, very low ebb. Later, as a serving Prime Minister, he introduced the edition of Australian Story, which documented my struggles with my gender identity. For that, he received cynical abuse from some quarters and almost no credit. I find the reluctance of some in the human rights and gender lobbies to acknowledge exactly what Tony Abbott did quite puzzling.
I'm back with Georgina Downer and Bruce Hawker. Georgina, a trans woman says she's puzzled that the human rights lobby wouldn't acknowledge Abbott's response. And in fact, just this week was another sneering attack on Abbott in the Fairfax Press. Are you puzzled?
No, I'm completely unsurprised. I mean, there's been such a cruel double standards with Tony Abbott. I mean, he's a strong Christian, fine, liberal Prime Minister, but he is accused of prejudice and bigotry, whereas a strong Christian Labor Prime Minister in Kevin Rudd never had such allegations made against him.
And I don't recall him saying much about transgender friends either.
Indeed.
Bruce, what is it about this culture of hatred and wanting to deny Abbott any credit at all, even for showing such compassion on the transgender issue? What is this?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think he, at a personal level, can identify with people if he knows them, he meets them. He understands their story, but I think at a much more macro level, he struggles with it. And he's really hoist on his own petard.
Where have you seen that? I haven't seen it.
Well,
For
example, when he was interviewed on 60 Minutes by Liz Hay in 2010, and she asked him about his attitude towards homosexuals, and he said, "Oh, I'd feel uncomfortable in their company." And
he did not say I feel uncomfortable in their company.
I feel threatened by them. In other words, he said things which really made it very difficult for people to say, well, you actually do empathise.
His sister?
Yes.
The support he gave his sister who's
by the same
I can't imagine he's uncomfortable in his sister's
But by the same
company.
token, he ties his party to a party vote on gay marriage. He won't say, I'll give you a conscience vote on that. So he says things...
That's a different issue.
That's a different issue.
Yeah,
It's all about his attitude towards these issues. At a personal level, I think, yes, to Kate McGregor, he's obviously shown real support. To his sister, yes, very real support. But when it comes down...
to his friends, what about Christopher Pearson, the gay columnist, the great gay columnist, close friend,
Very close.
was a speechwriter. I mean, this is
very,
ridiculous.
very close. You know, and so that's him on one hand, but at the macro level, he says these things which make people think, well, he's not really empathetic at all when it comes to policy.
I just don't understand
but he's
why
the Prime
he's
Minister. I mean,
always held to such a high
but we can
standard.
all be empathetic as citizens to our friends. If you're the Prime Minister, you've got an opportunity to do things. And he hasn't done things. He hasn't. Bind his party to have gay marriage as part of the
that's a different
policy
issue.
of the Liberal
That is a
Party.
completely different issue.
He's the only Prime Minister who goes up to Northern Australia and lives with Aboriginal communities, and yet he's accused of being callous about his policies on Indigenous Australians.
And racist, according to the Greens. It is so
But hang
bizarre.
on, you can do it at a local level. You've got to do it at a national level if you're the Prime Minister.
That's conflating issues.
No, it's not.
Listen,
It's being
the
realistic.
hatred is astonishing. Take this from the left is astonishing. This week on the ABC, for example, Georgina has really had to apologise recently for two gross attacks on Conservatives, calling me a racist, but more importantly, Chris Kenny got called... well, a dog effer and shown allegedly sodomising a dog in a doctored photo. This week, it broadcast this about Tony Abbott.
OK, clearly I'm joking, but I feel it necessary to point this out because quite clearly you're a dumb
That was a pre-recorded thing put to air by the ABC. How do you explain that?
I don't want to explain that. I mean, this is our national broadcaster paid for by taxpayers. It should be held to a higher standard than commercial broadcasters. It should be neutral. That's clearly not neutral. It's actually...
It always happens. It's never against someone on the left.
No,
it's
but I mean,
incredible.
the ABC actually is belittling itself in the eyes of mainstream Australians.
I think we should privatise it like the Victorian Branch Resolution said this week. Do you agree with, or the other day, do you agree with your Victorian Branch Resolution?
Look, I don't think we're ready to go that far.
Well, it's your resolution. Look, there's nothing Tony Abbott can do that the left will give him credit for. And similarly, there's nothing Barack Obama can do that the left won't dump him for. Take this. Here are some of the terrible mistakes he's made in the Middle Eastern policy, Bruce. He's helped to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya. Now it's an Islamist stronghold or base. He's treated Israel as an enemy. He did nothing about the Islamic State when that was taking off. Now he's made a deal with Iran, a fascist state supporting terrorism, a deal that lets it keep most of its infrastructure to build a nuclear weapon. I mean, for heaven's sake. Former Vice President Dick Cheney this week said, if Obama's plan was actually to destroy America's power, he's succeeding. Have a look.
If you had somebody as president who wanted to take America down, who wanted to fundamentally weaken our position in the world, reduce our capacity to influence events, turn our back on our allies and encourage our adversaries, it would look exactly like what Barack Obama is doing.
Suggesting it's deliberate. Georgina, what do you think?
Well, I think Barack Obama still has a way to go before he gives Jimmy Carter a run for his money.
Or Jeb Bush. Or George Bush.
But, I mean, he clearly has shown he's not as strong as his resolve as we would like. I mean, what he did on Syria, he said there was a red line. If Syria used chemical weapons, they did use chemical weapons. He did nothing. Russia then quickly goes and annexes eastern Ukraine. He's sending out the wrong message there. But look, he may very well at the end of his presidency think he has some significant foreign policy achievements in the agreement with Iran. And look, he's
Are you backing the agreement with Iran?
And his renewed friendship and reconciliation with Cuba and the Castros.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
It's ironic in the extreme that Dick Cheney, the person who was basically the architect of the US intervention into Iraq in the first place, that led to Al-Qaeda being in Iraq, which had been kept out of Iraq by Saddam Hussein, is making those criticisms. I mean, the story of American foreign policy is written by Dick Cheney and George Bush. It's remarkable, absolutely remarkable.
End of the Bush-Cheney administration, Iraq pacified. End of the Obama administration, Islamic State controls half. Islamic State is strong in Syria. Iran's on the way to getting a nuclear weapon. Libya is an Islamic...
You know who committed,
for heaven's sake...
Do you know who committed the United States to be out of Iraq by 2011? George Bush. They were always going to be moving out of Iraq. Why? Because it was just killing their economy as well as killing their men and women.
We've got to go. We've got to go. The worrying thing
is... to George Bush.
We've got to go. The worrying thing is Hillary Clinton will announce she's running for president. We could have 4 or 8 more years of this nonsense.
Good news.
Georgina Downer, Bruce Hawker, thank you so much for your time. Brass, we could have had a debate there. Coming up, the one word the ABC didn't want to mention over Easter.